Now, this is a passage that we don't really talk a whole lot about. I've never actually heard it preached on before, so I'm excited to open it up and let's take a look at it this morning. We're about to enter into the Pentecost season, and so we're really going to be focusing on what it means to be a church, and that's kind of the focus of Pentecost, and so this passage is kind of warming us up for that. One of the highlights of my week that I get to have while I'm here at Payson Park is when I get to help out with the preschool and do a little social emotional stuff with them on Fridays. It's super fun. The preschoolers, we pretend to be jungle animals and big tall mountains, and we go on adventures in the jungle and look for the little babies in the jungle and try to be real quiet, and we practice respecting each other's space, slowing down our breath, taking breaths when we need them, how to self-regulate. We practice all these things through games. It's fun. And then that's just supplementing a lot of the great work that the teachers are already doing with them. And all of that together builds so that by the time they get to the pre-K, they've built up some skills. And now we're, in that class, I'm doing some imaginative storytelling with them. And their ability to tell some stories has really exponentially grown over the course of the last several months, and they use that as an opportunity to share themselves, and it's beautiful. We start sitting down, I show them a piece of paper, and I show them a little scene and say, what's going on here? And they start to share. And they work together now to tell the story. They take turns, right? They're learning, figuring out how this works. They take turns on how they tell the story. They're drawing the story out as they go, and as they do that, they're, oh, hey, you have the blue crayon that I want. Can I borrow that? And they share. And they don't yell at each other, usually. Sometimes. They usually do okay. But it's really cool to see how they just are starting to work together. They affirm each other's stories when they're telling them to each other. This past Friday, one of the kids really wanted to write their name. They were really intent on putting their name down on the bottom. And they wanted to use the ballpoint pen that I had instead of one of the markers. And I was like, you just use one of the markers. This is my pen. And without skipping a beat, the kid says, sharing is caring. And of course, who can argue with that, right? I was like, okay. You're right, because clearly Miss Tammy has been working with them to when they get kind of possessive and say, this is my block or this is my bear, then they've been taught to say, actually, think about how you might want this later, and then learn how to share it. So they're learning. There are spoken and unspoken rules to the way a preschool classroom works, and the kids are picking up on this and they understand. It's like a classroom is kind of like a living organism. A church can be like that too, but I'm thinking like when we think about that preschool classroom and how the dynamics work, how they're supposed to work at least. Fairness, we're supposed to treat everybody the same, very strong sense of right and wrong, what's just and not just. We take turns, we share, we do all these things. Let me let this person in, if it pops up. I have to play double duty here, I apologize. When a person seeks more than their fair share of toys or attention, and the whole system starts feeling that tension. And the teachers help remind them of the rules and their emotional strategies so that the system eventually will stabilize. And then over time, the kids internalize this and they say sharing is caring to their friends. And then they can kind of sort of, not police themselves, but monitor themselves, right? So much of early childhood education is about this. It's about how do we relate to each other? How do we make community? How do we form a community? That's so much of what we focus on at that early childhood age. We think it's so important, as important, if not more important, than all the reading fundamentals and the early math and the earth science and the music. All that stuff's great. But this stage is learning how to be in community together. We use the term socialization traditionally, this idea. And children need to be taught this, but they mostly get the core ideas pretty quickly. Because again, we have that kind of internal sense of right and wrong and justice, and we can start putting ourselves in each other's shoes a little bit. Eventually, they start to learn that I can't hoard the stuffed whale toy all for myself, because that means I can't play with it. If I did that, then others can't play with it, right? And then I wouldn't want that to happen to me. So they figure all this stuff out. And then what happens is they get older, right? And at some point along the way in school, there's a shift. A shift from that focus on socialization to achievement. And it's a gradual process, but it eventually gets there. It makes sense because we believe learning how to be in community, I think in some ways we think that it kind of stops in the third grade. We kind of learn the basics of how to get along and share, and then we kind of put that aside and we're done with it. And then we can move on. But I'm not so sure. I'm a parent of a third grader now, so this is kind of on the front of my mind. I'm watching how this focus is shifting in real time. He's now preparing for his MCAS, right? The state tests. And he's doing this as a third grader, and he's feeling the anxiety about that. And I'm trying to help him cope with that, and I'm helping him strategize, and I'm trying to tell him that, it's not all about the tests and the results, but at the same time, I'm feeling anxious, if I'm being honest. And here, this is confession morning, right? Like, I'm letting you all know that sometimes parents maybe import some of that anxiety into the situation. Sometimes. I'm not going to say who. Right. And, we'll talk about standardized testing another day. That's a whole thing. JoJo has great teachers, right? And I know that there's a lot of elementary school teachers that are very aware and try to help children who are trying to figure out how to get along, work together. They're still working on that stuff here and there, but eventually more and more and more, there's a diminishment over time in the face of the pressures of schooling and the demands of what schooling is. And all that emotional stuff kind of gets shoved to school counselors and specialists and individual therapists and parents maybe. As much as great teachers want to acknowledge gifts and abilities in our students, eventually that focus shifts to grades and achievement and standards and because that's the goal of schooling, if we're being honest. It's to prepare children and youth for the real world, which we all know is based on competition. That's kind of what we're taught, the haves and the have-nots. We all want our children to be among the haves, even if we know that that means that there will be other children who will not have. Which is, we might justify with this idea of they didn't earn it, they didn't work hard enough, or more likely I just kind of don't want to even think about it if I'm being honest. Again, I told you this is confession morning, right? Because I feel this turmoil as someone who believes in the God who is turning the world upside down. In the idea that God is seeking to make things right in the world, and that communities, not just of preschoolers, but youth and adults, they can actually do this. We can actually create a community of balance together. And I've seen what can happen when you create these kind of supportive communities for people. But I also live in a capitalistic economy, and I live in this environment, and I live in this job market, and I want my child to survive. I want my child to thrive. And I feel that anxiety that I know is only going to go stronger as he progresses through school. Even though I know that from my faith and my training that teaches me that he will only survive and thrive if we do it together. And yet, there's a tension. Many of you know that I'm also an adjunct professor at a small Catholic university where I teach on religion and ethics. And I feel like a big part of my job there is now I'm meeting kids way up at like 18 and 19 and 20. So a little further down the line. And now they are as focused on individual success as you possibly can be, because this is the time of life to do that. And they are focused on their studies, focused on their future careers, and thinking about maybe at times what their dream life might be. And I feel like a big part of my job is just to remind them to not forget about the common good, to not forget about other people around you, that you're flourishing in this world. Your true joy will come from recognizing that you are tied to the people around you, and that it matters where your clothes came from, etc. I tell them that there's two competing myths we have about the nature of things. One is that there's this is an amoral universe, and that we must compete and win in order to survive. Resources are scarce, and we must scrape and claw our way to the top. And the corollary of this is that those on top are more deserving than those who are not. The other myth is that we live in a moral universe, that throughout the created order we see flows of communion and balance, complex ecosystems and symbiotic relationships between species, and energy transfers and life cycles and planetary motions and seasons. When natural systems have pressure put on them, they get out of whack, they get out of balance, and they seek to self-regulate, much like that preschool classroom. And when I talk to them about this, I ask them which one will they choose. When we get to the issue of the environment, it's amazing how quickly they clue in, because they know the world we've left them. And so they understand, even if they don't buy the other things that I'm selling them, at least they get the need for a sustainable future. That seems to be very much on the hearts and minds of young people these days, and rightly so, because our system needs some balance, and we need to be a part of that. Maybe if only we all remembered what we learned in preschool. So I'm asking us all this morning the same question that I'm asking my students. In our daily lives, which of these stories do we embody? The story of scarcity or the story of balance? What kind of community do we want to live in? What do we need to learn? When we hear the word balance, sometimes we think of other world religions, and Taoism, is one example where you see that that's a spiritual focal point, the idea of balance. But I actually think this idea is very, not antithetical to Christianity. I think it's quite compatible with it. The idea of the notion of the kingdom of God, the community of God, that Jesus came to establish and cultivate this community. After all, didn't he say to the little disciples to let the children come to me? Maybe the children paid attention in preschool. There's something that we need to learn from them. Unless you approach the reign of God like a child, you'll never enter it. These kinds of things. From the very start, after the church was established, with the coming of the Spirit at Pentecost, which we're celebrating next week, we see a community where everyone's worshiping together. They share what they have, though. They share their food. They share their funds. They share it all in common. Sharing is caring. Slaves and free persons are worshiping together. Think about how radical this is. Women have standing in importance alongside men in ways that they didn't in the rest of Greco-Roman culture. They're a community, imperfectly, but still in their own way seeking balance in a world that puts people into castes and values power and status above all else. And so here, years later, is when our passage in 2 Corinthians happens, and the church has now spread throughout the Mediterranean, among the Jewish and non-Jewish people, in no small part due to the efforts of our author, the Apostle Paul. And that community in Jerusalem is still there. And guess what they're still doing? They're still sharing. They're still sharing their resources. They're still sharing and distributing those resources to the poor. And they're in need because they're sharing. But part of it is that they see themselves as part of a giant system, an ecosystem, with those churches around the Mediterranean. And the Macedonian churches understood this. Macedonian churches are also not so well off. But you know what they did? They gave. They gave generously. They gave sacrificially, even when it was hard, because they knew that what the Jerusalem church was doing, and they wanted to support it. And now Paul is coming to the Corinthians. The Corinthians are not poor. They have some means. He is asking them to support their fundraising efforts as well. And he doesn't command them, as you see in the text. You have the text there in your bulletin if you want to look at it. They're not commanding them. It's not a forced taxation, but it's an encouragement to see the communities as one symbiotic organization. Our English translations often fail us in our Bible text. I hate to break it to you. They do the best they can. There's no perfect translations. Some translations use the word grace for the word that we see over and over again to talk about Jesus' gift, the gift that the church is called to share. That word gift is often translated grace. And that we think of grace as something that means spiritual sharing. We think of it in spiritual terms. And, it would be like, if we're offering it, it would be like giving somebody their thoughts and prayers, which means something to a degree, but it's not the same thing as sharing monetarily. So then other translations come in and say, no, we need to make sure that they understand that this is a physical thing, so we're going to translate it as gift, a generous act. And so that's what we read here in our text here. The NRSV says this. The problem is that it's both. It's not separate. It's both spiritual and it's economic. It's the word charis. Charis. It's grace. It's gift. It's blessing. It's favor. And the word is the same all the way through the text, and you don't see this unless you're reading it in the Greek. So it has distinct financial implications, especially in the Roman world of the day, because it was a system of patronage, and the idea of patronage was to charis. But it also had spiritual implications. Paul used the same word. Grace is the movement of the living Spirit of God. It's the movement of the living Spirit of God through the living organism of the church. It's lifeblood. If we're just one big organism, it's like the blood that moves through it. There's one of the most important theologians of the 20th and 21st century is Gustavo Gutierrez, and he translates this in Spanish, and Spanish has no problem keeping these ideas together in the word gratuidad. But it gets translated as gratuitousness because we don't have the right word in English, so it comes out gratuitousness. It's the same idea. It's grace. It captures the double meaning. It's abundance. The word excel, if you look at verse 7, there's the word, if you all excel in these things, and now you need to excel in your generosity. The word excel actually means to overflow, to abound. It's abundance. Just as God's abundant grace overflows to us, so we are called to overflow with generosity to others. It is a manifestation of the grace that we've been shown to be called to be generous and compassionate people in concrete ways. Because we've been loved, because we've been saved, because we've been forgiven, we pour out. In all organic systems, there's energy and there's balance. And for Paul in the community of God, our connection to the Spirit of God means that we're plugged into this never-ending power source. It's grace. And we are its conduits in the world. We share love, we share with each other, we share beyond ourselves. The Corinthians who live in blessing in so many ways are called to share that blessing. In fact, to be the blessing. And as Paul anticipates their reaction in verse 13, he says, well, I'm not asking you to give all just to make your lives miserable, right? He's not asking you to give beyond the point where you're miserable now and you're going to make life easy street for other people. It's almost like he's anticipating what we might say today. It's about balance. You live in abundance and they live in need, and you're all part of the same organism. And when we live in excess, that's also a kind of imbalance. And then verse 14 says, their abundance may be for your need. He reverses it again. You give to them and they're going to give to you. I can't help remember or think about times when, and maybe you all have had examples of this in the past, where you've gone on a service trip or a mission trip, or you have encountered somebody in need and you've shown what you've given what you had, and then you come away from that interaction feeling like you received more than you gave. If you've ever felt like that before, I know that that's the reaction and the feeling that many people have. And I can't help but think it's almost as if the system is designed to function this way, to flow and to share and to care. I have a little chart. I always have to have a prop. It's not going to show up well on this camera, but I'm going to show it. It's just a chart. It's like a 2x2 matrix. This says, where are you abundant and where are you in need? I think it's time for us to stop thinking about haves and have-nots, and time to think about, we all have abundance, we all have need, and where can we flow? We have, maybe right now, you might feel emotionally full and abundant, but maybe economically you're feeling like you're in need. Or maybe vice versa, or maybe you're in need in both places. And right now you'll need the community more. But that's how we relate to each other. We better not lose battery, huh? Abundance of battery? Why are we not plugged in? make sure that we're plugged in. Hold on. This should have been. Sorry, I'm just, ounce of prevention, pound of care. All right. So just be thinking about this idea. I'm going to leave this up. I'm going to put it in the back. And maybe, if you have any ideas, you can write them in, or just think about it for yourself as a way of thinking about the flow and the balance of a system. We are the living body of God in Christ in the world. God is wanting to move and live. And when we move and live, that it's not a zero-sum game. It goes out and it's abundant and it multiplies. So where can we give? And recognizing that there are times when we will be in need as well. We're not always going to feel like we have a lot to give. But that's when the system comes in and helps and regulates. So it's a thought process. Where are you feeling in need this morning? If you're feeling abundant, how can you share that abundance? In contrast to the rat race we get in when we focus on, do we have enough? Which we never will. But instead we ask God where you're abundant, and you feel that and share from that abundance. When you do that, it's no longer feeling so onerous or dutiful. It feels like a joy. It feels like something that we can do not begrudgingly or out of rote obligation, but out of a manifestation of grace. You're living in the grace by sharing it, not hoarding it. So where are you economically, or maybe with the power that you have opportunity where the system is working for you or not working for you. And then spiritual or emotional, you might feel like you have a lot of resources right now, or you might feel a little thin. We're human, and this is how we support each other. Because then when we're in need, we might need that grace. We might need somebody to share it with us. And we have to be willing to receive as well as to give. It's not about having one group over another. It's about how we can work together and support each other. So I'm going to leave this up. I'm going to put that in the back, and I invite you to just ask yourself as we're thinking here, where is it that you have abundance? And where you can share? And where is it that you have need? Where the community of God can pour grace into you? And do you know who to ask? Are there people here that you can ask? As we anticipate the coming of Pentecost next week, we celebrate the gift of the Spirit that is the lifeblood of the church. I invite you to join me in a spirit of prayer, and we will move into our larger prayer time.